Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're stripping away the rosy nostalgia of the early 20th century and looking directly at the cold, hard data of compensation. We're talking about how people actually got paid, what their money could realistically buy, and the often brutal systemic structures that completely dictated everyday survival from 1901 right up to the Great Depression.
$750. Now, you hear a number like that today for an entire year's household income, and it sounds, well, almost imaginary, right? But back in 1901, this was the absolute baseline for American families. The country was just shifting from domestic agriculture into this massive industrial powerhouse. And to really grasp that era of explosive growth, we've got to understand what it actually meant to try and scrape together a life on just $750 a year.
Moving into Section 1, the low-wage baseline and survival in 1901.
Picturing this day-to-day reality is absolutely crucial. Imagine you're an average manufacturing worker in 1901, pulling in about 23 cents an hour. Now let's say you just want to buy a single pound of butter. At 27 cents, that's going to cost you more than an hour of grueling, back-breaking labor. A pound of round steak? 14 cents. A 5-pound bag of flour? 13 cents. I mean, when your hourly rate is literally 23 cents, every single penny is spoken for. Your household budget's margin for error is exactly zero.
And the demographic indicators from the time really drive this home. We're looking at families averaging nearly 5 people, all trying to survive on those incredibly meager wages. Think about this. The average household was spending over 42% of its entire income on food alone. Add in housing and clothes, and boom, nearly 80% of a family's budget is instantly wiped out just on the bare necessities. To just barely scrape by, a lot of households couldn't even rely on a single breadwinner. They had to take in boarders, or even worse, send their kids into the workforce.
Which brings us to Section 2, Employment at Will Realities, and the reality of zero job security. You see, beyond just the shockingly low pay, laborers were completely at the mercy of the employment at will doctrine. It meant exactly what it sounds like: zero job security. Unemployment insurance? Not a thing. Employer-sponsored retirement? Yeah, right. Only whatever pennies you could stash away from your 23 cents an hour. But honestly, the most terrifying part was the complete lack of a safety net for injuries. If you suffered a severe permanent injury on the job, or, hey, if the factory boss just woke up and decided he didn't like you, you are out on the street, instantly. No compensation, no help.
All right, let's pivot to Section 3, the Ford $5 disruption, and what was ultimately a purely capitalist solution.
To really understand why Henry Ford made his famous move in 1914, we have to look at the unintended consequences of his own massive success. So Ford revolutionizes auto manufacturing with the assembly line, right? He slashes the time to build a Model T from over 12 hours to just 93 minutes. Incredible. But there was a huge hidden cost. This new work was mind-numbingly monotonous. Guys who used to take real pride in their craftsmanship were now just completely bored to tears, doing the exact same repetitious task for 9 hours straight. The result? They just walked out. Ford got hit with a highly expensive, absolutely crippling labor turnover rate of 370%. The company was just bleeding efficiency by constantly having to hire and train replacements.
So, with union organizers circling his unhappy workforce like sharks, Ford needed to actually keep his employees on the line. And his fix? A purely capitalist solution. On January 5, 1914, he completely shocked the industrial world. He more than doubled his minimum wage to $5 a day. And on top of that, he shortened the workday from 9 hours down to 8. At the time, this was completely unheard of. It was revolutionary. But here is what you really need to take away from this. Ford's famous wage hike? It was not charity. Actually, scratch that. It was the exact opposite. It was a highly calculated, incredibly successful business disruption. Ford basically gambled that if he paid a premium wage, workers would finally tolerate the grinding monotony of his assembly lines. And you know what? He hit the nail on the head. Thousands of people literally flocked to Detroit. The workforce stabilized almost overnight. Those higher wages were completely offset by how much he saved on operating and training costs. In fact, Ford Motor Company's profits doubled between 1914 and 1916. He proved that investing in a well-paid workforce could yield massive corporate dividends. That takes us to Section 4, the clinical gender pay gap and the stark reality of a segregated workforce.
While innovations like Ford's $5 day were transforming things for male workers, and by the way, Ford didn't even extend that $5 wage to women until 1916, female workers were trapped in a completely different economic reality. The gender pay gap wasn't just some slight statistical blip, it was a clinical, fully institutionalized reality. Look at the New York garment industry between 1908 and 1911. Men were taking home a median wage of around $10 to $11 a week. Women, in the exact same industry, just $5 to $6. Across urban manufacturing, women routinely made only 50 to 60% of what men did. And trust me, this was no accident.
Just listen to this astonishingly blunt admission from a Brooklyn employer back in 1915. It perfectly captures how female labor was systematically undervalued. He openly admits to investigators that he could easily hire desperate women for $4.50 a week. Keep in mind, the minimum required just to survive in New York City at that time was $9 a week. Women were paid less for one simple reason. Employers knew that a lack of other opportunities and sheer desperation would absolutely force them to accept these poverty-level wages.
Moving on to Section 5, Segregated Markets, Unequal Pay.
The thing is, women weren't just getting paid less for doing the same work. They were purposefully boxed into a completely separate, unequal labor market. To really bring these numbers to life, you have to hear the story of Rose Schneiderman. She worked in a New York cap factory early in the century, making an average of just $5 a week. But here's the kicker. Just to have that job, she was forced to finance her own $45 sewing machine on an installment plan. When her factory tragically burned to the ground, her machine was completely destroyed. Rose and all the other women who had sacrificed huge chunks of their meager paychecks for their equipment got absolutely zero compensation. They lost everything.
And it wasn't just the low base pay. It was the sheer volume of petty deductions that compounded the indignity. Marginal employers were literally subsidizing their own businesses by squeezing arbitrary fees out of their workers' already poverty-level wages. Think about waitresses having $1 a week yanked from their checks just for laundry costs, or being forced to pay mandatory weekly fees to busboys. They even had their pay docked if a grumpy customer returned food to the kitchen. Every single penny was clawed back by the employer, which made any real economic independence virtually impossible.
Now you might be sitting there wondering, well, was this pay gap just because men held all the skilled jobs? Nope. Take a look at a 1909 study out of Pittsburgh. Even when you compare purely unskilled labor, the ratio of male to female wages was an unyielding 2 to 1. Unskilled men made $2 a day. Unskilled women, even the ones who had years of tenure and experience, maxed out at $1 a day. And it's really vital to point out that this systemic segregation went way beyond gender. Down in the South, the Jim Crow wage gap functioned in the exact same clinical way, institutionally suppressing the wages of black workers to create a deeply exploitable subclass of labor. It just proves that the pay gap was never about output. It was baked directly into the societal structure itself.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we have to look at how this whole era finally culminated. The intense volatility of trying to survive on 23 cents an hour, Henry Ford's massive market disruption, and this undeniable clinical segregation finally forced the government's hand. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed. It established the very first federal minimum wage at exactly 25 cents an hour, which, if you think about it, is barely a nudge higher than that 1901 baseline we started with today. So what does this all mean for us? Well, how do the ghosts of these early labor battles still secretly echo in our modern paychecks? How do they shape our societal expectations of what a hard day's work is truly worth? It's definitely something to chew on the next time you look at your own pay stub. Keep questioning the data, and thanks for joining me.